We just started a brand new sermon series going through the book of Exodus, and I know the timing is a little bit coincidental given our own kind of Exodus from Moses. But don't read too much into that. That was really purely coincidental. We finished our sermon series planning by the end of last year. So by November, we already had things mapped out, and this was not on our radar. But yes, we're going through the book of Exodus. And last week, Pastor Daniel kind of gave a general overview of the different themes and kind of the overall kind of movement through this massive narrative. And we kind of really honed in on this idea that God is a God who rescues his people out of bondage. Now, as you kind of enter into the second chapter in the book of Exodus, if you're kind of a careful reader of Scripture, you might feel a little bit of tension, because the fact of the matter is, the people of God are still in bondage in Egypt. I mean, God is this God who rescues his people out of slavery, out of bondage, and yet, what's going on here? The people are still enslaved in Egypt, and things look bad. Things look really bad. Just to kind of give some context once again, the Israelites had originally come to Egypt to find refuge from a terrible famine that was going on. If you remember back to the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, Joseph was sold into slavery by his own brothers. He eventually makes his way into Egypt, where he goes through all kinds of hardships, but by God's grace, he eventually climbs the ranks of power, and in his powerful position, he's able to rescue his family. He brings them into Egypt. They settle down into this new country, and they're doing pretty well, right? They start to lay down some roots, and they start to grow in Egypt. Well, eventually, Joseph, he passes away, and a new Pharaoh comes into power. And this new Pharaoh doesn't really know who Joseph is, and he doesn't care much for these Israelites. All he knows is that there is this growing group of immigrants in his country, and he does not want anything to do with them. And so he does a couple of things to try to, cut them down. First, he enslaves them, and he weighs them down with hard labor. But the people continue to multiply and grow. And so when that enslavement fails, he then turns to infanticide. He commands these midwives, these nurses who are delivering babies to kill the baby boys instead of birthing them alive. But the courageous midwives, they defy Pharaoh's orders, and the people continue to multiply, and they continue to grow. And so when that fails, Pharaoh now turns to complete genocide. He gives a command that all baby boys who are of a Hebrew background are to be cast into the Nile River. Right? These are some dark and desperate times. And on top of that, these are some confusing times, because the people are wondering to themselves, God, what is going on? I thought we were your people. I thought you were the one who brought us into this land. I thought you made a promise, a covenant with our father Abraham, that you would give us a land of our own, that we would be a great nation, and through us, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So what's happening here? Why are we enslaved in Egypt? Why are our children being killed? God, where are you in all of this? Right? These are some dark and desperate times. And at the end of chapter 1, it feels like the promises of God have failed. It feels like the people of God are doomed. It feels like all hope is lost. But here in chapter 2, we start to get a little glimmer of hope as we're introduced to the main human character of the book of Exodus, a guy named Moses. And Moses has quite the astonishing origin story. In fact, everything about his birth narrative that we're about to read in chapter 2 kind of hints at and points to the making of a great hero. And so let's take a look at this story here in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Let me read kind of this opening passage for us and just kind of make some comments as we make our way through these first 10 verses. So let me read this for us. It says this, Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. And the woman conceived, and she bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. All right, let's just pause here for a second. So here Moses is born. And instead of obeying Pharaoh's commands to throw all baby boys into the Nile River, his parents disobey Pharaoh's commands, and they decide to hide Moses. Now, two kind of interesting things to point out here real quick. First, we're told that Moses' parents come from the tribe of Levi. Now, their names are not even mentioned. Eventually, we'll get to know who these people are, but the narrator doesn't even tell us their names, but he tells us what family they belong to, the tribe of Levi. Now, the reason why that's important is because later on we'll find out that it's from the tribe of Levi that the priestly line arises. And this is kind of a foreshadowing of the role that Moses will one day play. He'll be a priest, someone who stands between, who mediates between God and the people. Now, just the other thing I just want to kind of mention here is Moses here is described as a fine child. Now, that can be a general reference to him being born healthy and strong, but that's a very unique choice of a word, because in the Hebrew, that word is very specific. It's the word tov, which means good. And it's the same word that God uses when he creates everything. And with each act of creation, he looks at all that he has made and he says, it is tov. It's good. See, this callback to creation back in Genesis 1 and 2 signifies the start of something new. God is initiating something here with the birth of this baby boy, this boy who is tov. And hope is beginning to rise. And we ask ourselves, who might this child be? Well, let's continue reading on in verse 3. Now, when she, this is Moses' mom, when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank, and his sister, this is Moses' sister, she stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. All right, so amazingly, let's just pause again. Now, Moses' parents are somehow able to keep Moses hidden for the first 3 months of his life. Now, any new parent will tell you that is quite the feat because infants love to cry. Like they love to scream, they love to shout. Like this is quite the feat, but somehow Moses is kept hidden. Well, eventually Moses becomes too big, he becomes too loud to remain hidden, and so in an act of faith, Moses' mom puts Moses in a basket and sets him along the Nile River. Now, to us reading this seems kind of strange. Like, man, should we report her to DPS? Like, what is she doing here? Like, why would she do such a thing? Now, I know that to us, this seems really kind of a strange practice to do, but in ancient civilizations, this was actually a pretty common practice where families would leave a child that they could not take care of along the riverbanks because those were the places that many people would gather for cooking and cleaning and washing and bathing. And they would see a child and they would take them in as their own. Right? That ancient practice is kind of similar to how maybe people today might kind of drop off their child if they're not able to take care of them at the steps of a hospital or an orphanage or a church. See, Moses was not being abandoned, but he was being entrusted into the care of another. Now, what's additionally interesting to note here is that the basket that Moses is placed in is called a very unique word in Hebrew. I know a lot of Hebrew today, but this is the last thing, right? In Hebrew. And that word in Hebrew is tevah. Now, the reason why that word is so interesting is because it's only used one other time in the entire Old Testament. And it's found in reference to Noah's ark. Same word, tevah, ark, and basket. Now, in this callback to Noah's ark, by calling this basket tevah, the narrator is trying to draw us to foreshadow what this boy would one day become. This vessel, this tevah, this ark of salvation that would carry people through the waters. Now, again, hope is starting to rise again. And again, we ask, who might this child be? Let's continue reading on in verse 5. Now, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. Now, while her young women walked beside the river, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the baby was crying, and she took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Now, this is probably one of the craziest twists in this whole sequence of events. Right after Moses is placed in a basket, he kind of floats along the Nile River, and he is picked up by none other than Pharaoh's daughter. Now, as the daughter of the king, Pharaoh's daughter would no doubt have known the command that her father had given to cast all Israelite boys into the Nile River. And she recognizes that this boy is indeed an Israelite, probably because he's circumcised. She sees this. But rather than following her father's decree and throwing Moses into the Nile River to kill him, her heart is filled with compassion. She takes pity on this child that is left alone crying in this basket, and she decides to take him in as her own. And again, hope is beginning to stir, and we ask, who might this child be? Let's continue on reading verse 7, last part of this introductory passage here. Then Moses' sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." Man, how awesome would it be if parents could be paid to raise their own kid? Like, oh, I'd be so rich, right? So the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." So here, as Moses has picked up Moses' older sister, who's been carefully watching from a distance this whole time, she steps in and she says, "Hey, I see that you found this Hebrew baby boy. I know someone who can nurse him for you. Do you want me to go and get her?" Pharaoh's daughter says, "Sure, that's a great idea." And so she goes and she gets Moses' own mom. And again, as I kind of pointed out, Moses' mom gets paid to take care of her own son. And in this one series of events, not only does Moses receive nutrition, not only does he receive bodily protection, now he's under the care of Pharaoh's daughter, so he's no longer in danger of being killed, thrown into the Nile River. Not only all those amazing things, but now Moses also receives spiritual instruction. He's raised by his own mother, who's able to pass on the heritage of faith. Well, eventually Moses is transferred over to being raised up in the household of Pharaoh's daughter. And as such, he's treated as Egyptian aristocracy. He's trained in the ways of princes, and he receives the finest education available at the time. From other historical records, we can kind of assume he would have been trained in the areas of linguistics, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, music, medicine, law, and diplomacy. All these things are being taught to him. And here with this birth narrative of Moses, we're meant to see God's hand at work. We're meant to kind of marvel at, man, God, what are you doing? Because these things can't just be coincidences, but what are you doing in carrying out your plan of salvation through this child? As one commentator puts it, at the very darkest moment of Israel's captivity, when evil was rampant and the tyrant seemed to triumph, at that very moment, God was working in history to save his people. And his plan called for a little child to be born in secret and then floated down the river right to Pharaoh's doorstep. And this is quite the origin story. And has all the makings of introducing us to the hero that Israel desperately needs. And as readers of this narrative, what we should be thinking is, man, as the people are crying out, this must surely be God's answer to their prayers. This must surely be the hero, the vindicator, the liberator that the people are in need as they find themselves in bondage as slaves in Egypt. Right? Our hearts are meant to feel a rising sense of hope. I want us to feel this because a lot of us might be familiar with the story. Maybe we've watched The Prince of Egypt, like, okay, we know how this goes. But I just want us to get what this narrator is trying to communicate for us as we get these first 10 verses of how Moses was born, of how he was found, of how he's raised in Pharaoh's own household. We're meant to be excited, imagining who this child might be. But then things take a turn for the worse. See, we fast forward many years ahead, and now Moses is a full-grown man. Acts 7 tells us that he's probably about 40 years at this time. And while he has been raised up as an Egyptian, he's never lost sight of his Hebrew roots because of his mother. And so one day, Moses goes out to kind of visit his fellow Israelites. And he's kind of wandering around the grounds. He witnesses an altercation between an Egyptian taskmaster and a Hebrew slave. And he sees this Egyptian taskmaster beating on this Hebrew slave. And in seeing this, Moses' heart is just filled with anger. And he gets so angry to the point that he ends up striking the Egyptian taskmaster and killing him. He digs a shallow grave in the sand and he tries to hide the body. Now, in many ways, Moses was driven by good intentions. I mean, he originally went out to express solidarity with his people, to identify with them in their suffering. And when he was confronted with blatant injustice, he stepped in to try to protect this helpless victim, to protect his fellow Israelite. In many ways, Moses was seeking to do what he thought he was born to do, to be a liberator, to be a hero, to be a leader. But Moses took the wrong approach. And his approach was wrong on many levels. Right? First off, his action was unnecessary. I mean, he could have stepped in all kinds of other ways without resorting to murder and violence. Secondly, his action was also unsanctioned. He had no proper authority to administer any kind of capital punishment. And lastly, his action was premature. He had not yet been called by God to liberate and rescue the people out of Egypt. But here, Moses sought to take action, to take matters into his own hands, and he ends up killing another person. Now, you might imagine that after committing murder, Moses might think, hey, it's probably a good idea if I just kind of lay low, right? Let me just kind of, step away for a little bit, let things cool down. But that's not what Moses does. He has kind of this brash attitude, which we'll kind of see throughout the rest of this book. But the very next day, he goes out again to see his fellow Israelites. And this time, he runs into two Israelites who are fighting with one another, and he tries to mediate and resolve the issue. But he ends up being rejected. These two Israelites say to him, hey, who do you think you are? Who made you king over us? We saw what you did the other day, killing that Egyptian slave master. Are you going to kill us too? Get out of here, man. We don't want anything to do with you. Here, Moses is utterly rejected. He probably expected a hero's welcome. He probably expected people saying, man, that was so amazing what you did, how you stood up to those Egyptian bullies. He probably expected to kind of stir up a popular revolt, an uprising to overthrow the Egyptian empire. But instead, Moses is turned away. That's quite shocking because, again, up to this point in time, this narrative, all signs seem to point towards Moses as this great hero who would go on to do great things. But he's rejected by the very people he sought to save, and his failure nearly derails everything. See, Moses, yes, he had a zeal, an ambition to deliver God's people, but he was not yet ready to carry out God's work in God's way. See, yes, Moses thought he could bring about God's salvation, but he thought that he could do so through his own strength. And so he operated as a self-appointed savior, taking it upon himself to lead Israel out of Egypt. But by seeking to carry out things in his own way, he actually forfeits the privilege to do so. See, here's the thing. We forfeit God's call on our lives when we refuse to do God's work in God's way. We forfeit God's call on our lives when we refuse to carry out God's work in God's way, and instead we seek to do things our own way. And there are three kind of general ways this kind of plays out. See, first, we forfeit God's call on our lives when we pursue after the wrong vision. Right? Instead of pursuing after what God has called us to do, what God has for us, we end up pursuing something else, something that we would rather pursue for ourselves. Right? Maybe God has gifted you with a family, a lot of parents in this room. And maybe you've been given the incredible responsibility of raising up kids. But instead of seeking after God's vision to train up your children in the training and instruction of the Lord, maybe your vision for them is to kind of live vicariously through them. Right, let me give them all the things that I didn't get to enjoy as a kid. And sometimes it takes kind of two extremes, right? For some of us, we end up parenting them like very strictly. Like, I want you to excel. I want you to succeed. I want you to take care of, to make the most of all the opportunities that I never got to have. And so, we work them to the ground. Or on the other extreme, we just kind of spoil them to death. I never got to go on vacations. I never got to hang out with my friends. I never got to enjoy all these nice things. And so here you go. I'm just going to drown you with stuff. But in so doing, by pursuing the wrong vision, we end up forfeiting God's call on our lives. Secondly, we can forfeit God's call in our lives when we proceed with the wrong motives. Instead of being driven by a desire to honor God, to love others, we do things for the wrong reasons. Maybe God has gifted you with a tremendous mind for business, maybe a tremendous skill set in your career field. Right? Maybe God has given you opportunities to really make a deep impact or to generate a lot of wealth, to really add value to society. But maybe you find yourself being motivated by selfish ambition, by vain conceit. Yes, you put in the hours. Yes, you secure the results. But honestly, it's to feed your own ego. It's to feed your own greed. It's to feed your own vanity. But by proceeding with the wrong motives, we end up forfeiting God's call in our lives. Lastly, we can forfeit God's call in our lives when we carry out the wrong actions. Instead of doing what is right in God's sight, we seek to do what is convenient, what is expedient, even if it goes against God's commands. Maybe God has blessed you with some amazing opportunities, whether that's an education, a job, a platform, relationships, whatever it might be. But instead of doing things in a God-honoring way, maybe you find yourself cutting corners. Maybe you find yourself engaging in questionable actions because this is how everyone else gets to the top. And you struggle and you strive and you make it there. But by pursuing the wrong actions, you've actually forfeited God's call on your life. See, we forfeit God's call on our lives when we refuse to carry out God's work in God's way and instead seek to carry out God's work in our own way. That's exactly what Moses does. Moses was right to think that God had called him to liberate his people out of Egypt, but he sought to do that work in his own way. In doing so, Moses forfeits his call. And having been rejected by his own people, having been exposed for his crimes, Moses ends up running away from Egypt. He fears for his own life, and he escapes to a wilderness area called Midian. And as we kind of get to this point in the narrative, it feels like it's all over. Man, like, what happened to those amazing first 10 verses? Like, our hopes were set sky high, thinking this guy was it. And now this great hero has gone into hiding in the middle of nowhere. But it's here in Midian where God does his work to prepare Moses for the call that he has placed on his life. And this is what I'm calling the Midian Experience. See, the Midian Experience involves the detours of life that lead us into obscurity and humility, which ultimately teach us to carry out God's work in God's way. The Midian experience encompasses those roadblocks and setbacks that actually refine you so that you can fulfill God's call on your life in the right way. In other words, the Midian experience will break you so that God can remake you and set you on his kingdom path, so that God can form in you the right vision and stir in you the right motives and strengthen you to carry out the right actions. This is the Midian experience, right? Take a look at Moses' Midian experience here in Exodus 2, verses 15 to 22, the last part of our passage. It says this: Now, when Pharaoh heard of it, right, when Pharaoh hears about how Moses kills this Egyptian, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh, and he stayed in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. Now, the priests of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and saved them, and he watered their flock. And when they had come home to their father Reuel, he said to them, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock." And he said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Right? Why have you left the man? Like, he's a good dude, right? And call him in that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom. For he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." And so here, Moses enters his Midian experience. See, Midian is a place where Moses goes to die to himself. Here in Midian, Moses goes from being a privileged prince in Pharaoh's household to an exiled sojourner in a foreign land. He goes from a high position of power to a low position of obscurity. He goes from being at the center of the world at that time to being in the middle of nowhere wilderness. This is his Midian experience, and already he's learning humility. As he sits by a well, an altercation arises as these Midianite women come to water their flocks of sheep. But as they're trying to do so, these other group of shepherds come in and they start to harass them, they berate them, they keep them from doing what they're trying to do. But this time, as Moses intervenes, instead of flying off into this murderous rage, Moses restrains himself and only uses the force needed to drive off the shepherds. And afterwards, he ends up bringing water for the sheep belonging to these women. Now, to us, that might just seem like a nice, kind gesture for someone to do, but back in this ancient culture, it was actually seen as a menial and undignified task for a man to draw out water for women. But here, Moses demonstrates real humility. He stoops to serve, and he learns that true leadership requires humble service. Well, eventually, Moses settles down in Midian. He starts a family of his own, and when he has a son, he interestingly names him Gershom, which can roughly be translated as sojourner. Now, at first glance, we might think that Moses names his son Gershom in reference to his exile, to his sojourning in Midian. But that's not the reference, because, again, he uses the past tense. He says, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." That's past tense. That's not a reference to his time in Midian. That's a reference to his time back in Egypt. See, in naming his son Gershom, Moses comes to a breaking point with his past. He's dying to himself. And he's putting to rest the glamour of his Egyptian upbringing, and he embraces a life of obscurity and humility. And he actually spends the next 40 years living in the land of Midian. You know, for the first 40 years of his life in Egypt, Moses grew up thinking that he was somebody. He thought that he was a big shot, destined to do big things. He thought that he could do whatever he wanted, do whatever he pleased. He grew up as somebody living in Pharaoh's court, and he thought that he was going to be this great hero to take down the empire from within. But in these next 40 years in Midian, Moses learns to embrace being a nobody, someone living in obscurity and humility. No one knows who he is. No one knows or cares about where he's from. He learns to die to himself. And it's only through this experience that he learns that God can use anybody to accomplish his kingdom purposes, so long as that person is willing to do God's work in God's way. Because at the end of the day, it's not Moses or any of us who's a true hero, but it's God himself who's a true hero. And we see this at the end of chapter 2, in verses 23 to 25. Let me just summarize here. We're taken back to Egypt, and we see that God has not forgotten his people who are enslaved in Egypt. And as the people cry out to God under the burden of their slavery, we see here that God listens to their groaning. He remembers his covenant. He sees the people, and he knows them. In other words, God is still at work. He's still carrying out his plan of salvation. Now, we have to wait until next Sunday to kind of see this crazy encounter that Moses has with God in the wilderness. But for now, we see again that God is continuing to carry out his plan of salvation even in a place like Midian, even in a Midian experience. And likewise, if we want to faithfully carry out God's call in our lives, we too need to patiently embrace our Midian experience. That's the simple application for today's sermon. Embrace the Midian experience. We too need to accept the detours of life that lead us into obscurity and humility, because that's the only way that we'll learn to do God's work in God's way. See, when we find ourselves in a Midian experience, we learn that failure is never final. We learn that humility is actually strength. We learn that faithfulness is God's measure of success. When we embrace the Midian experience, we learn to let go of all the things we used to hold on to for our sense of meaning, identity, status, and purpose. And we learn to find our identity in who God says we are, not what our accomplishments or family or status or society says who we might be. When we embrace the Midian experience, we gain a greater clarity as to what God has actually called us to do. We gain a bigger vision for living for the things of God's kingdom. And perhaps most importantly, as we're going to see next week, when we embrace the Midian experience, we actually get to encounter the living God. We get to encounter him in some pretty astonishing ways. Now, the Midian experience will seem like a long, unnecessary detour, but don't lose heart. This is the way. God knows exactly what he is doing. You are not lost. You are not forgotten. He is breaking you in order to remake you, to carry out his work in his way. Just trying to give a small, somewhat silly example of what the Midian experience might look like, just from my own life. When I was 23, I became a pastor. I don't recommend that, being a pastor that young. But I was here serving at OMC in junior high ministry as an unpaid intern. What that essentially means is, hey, we want you to preach every Sunday, teach Bible studies every Friday, plan retreats, disciple students, right? Navigate cultural complexities with parents, do drop-offs and picks up, like buy food, manage budgets. Like, we want you to do all of that. We want you to do it for free. Like, treasures in heaven, like you're going to be richly blessed in the future, somewhere out there in the ether, right? Now, I agreed to this, and so I have no one else to blame but myself. At the time, I had just graduated from UCLA. I was 1 year into my master's program at USC, right? I was at the best university in LA and like the okay university in LA as well. And yet, I'll let you determine like which is which. And yet, despite all that, junior high ministry was the hardest thing I had ever done up to that point in my life. Because let's be real, middle schoolers are the worst. They're just like, there's no way around. Like, they're the worst. And all y'all who serve in youth, like, you know, like, they can be like pretty brutal. Well, I remember this one Friday night. I was busy with papers and exams for grad school, but I spent hours that week preparing this Bible study lesson for our Friday night gathering. And I was like, texting all these students like, hey, you better show up. Like, I've been pouring my blood, sweat, and tears, all my time into this. Like, I want you to see there. I want to be able to see you there on Friday for Bible study. And I was expecting kind of a large turnout. At the time, our youth group had about 50 to 60 students. But when the day came for Bible study, only 2 showed up, 2 out of 60. And as I saw these students, I was so discouraged. In fact, I was so defeated that I just decided to cancel Bible study on the spot. Like, forget this. It's not worth it. And we decided to just get dinner at Chipotle on Larchmont. And I told them, hey, thanks for coming out. I'm sorry I canceled Bible study on you, but at least let's get dinner, right? Dinner's on me. You can order whatever you want, which is a mistake to tell any hungry teenage boys because, of course, right, as they order their burritos, they order extra meat. They order guac. They order extra guac and chips on the side. Like, who does that? Like, they order a drink. Like, no, get the water cup, man. Like, don't you know I'm an unpaid intern? And I remember in those early years, like, just crying out to God, what gives? Like, didn't you call me to be a pastor? Didn't you call me to disciple a new generation of passionate followers? Didn't you call me to shape and influence lives? Didn't you call me to do the work of ministry? If I'm honest, I feel like I'm more of a janitor, an Uber driver, a cook, a babysitter than a pastor. Like, what gives? And yet in that moment, I felt like God was reminding me, yes, Josh, I have called you to be a pastor. And that's exactly why you're going through this. Because you have not yet learned to lay down your life for your people. but through this you will. Through this you will see that cooking, cleaning, doing drop-off and pickups are all ways that you fulfill the ministry that I've called you to. It took me 4 years of youth ministry to learn that lesson, and I'm still learning it today. But that simple Midian experience was so crucial for me to faithfully carry out what God has called me to do here and now. For you too, maybe as you find yourself in a Midian experience, would you embrace it as God's very means of preparing you? That this is not an accident, but this is God at work in your life in this particular season. And so maybe you're a student and you're tired of the endless exams and papers and projects that just feel so pointless, and you can't wait to get out there into the real world, which is not that great, by the way. Would you embrace the season and be diligent with your studies because God's at work? Maybe you're at the bottom of the totem pole at your job and you feel so underappreciated, so overlooked. Embrace the season and work with excellence because God's at work. Maybe you're a parent with young kids or even older kids, and the days feel so long. The days feel so exhausting. You get to the end of it and you wonder, man, did I accomplish anything? Would you embrace this season? Maybe drink another cup of coffee and keep loving on your kids because God's at work. Or maybe you've been told all your life that you have so much potential, but then you find yourself with unfulfilled dreams, unfulfilled passions. You feel just kind of stuck in life, and you wonder to yourself, is this what I imagined my life to look like when I had all these ideas and dreams and hopes for the future? Embrace the season and keep pressing forward because God is at work in your Midian experience. Church, may we embrace the Midian experience. May we embrace the detours and roadblocks and setbacks of life that lead us into obscurity and humility, because this is how God breaks us to remake us. This is how we learn to carry out God's work in God's way. This is how we learn to gain the right vision, to grow in the right motives, and to carry out the right actions. You can bow your heads with me at this time. We'll spend some time in prayer and reflection as we respond to God's word together. For you, maybe you feel like you are right now in a Midian experience. Maybe the dreams that you had seem to be shattered. Maybe plans that you have seem to be put on hold. Maybe this is not how you imagined your life to turn out. Would you trust that you are exactly where God has called you to be? And would you embrace this season for what it is? It is a season of sanctification. It is a season of revealing things in your heart. It is a season of being broken so that you would be remade. And as you find yourself in this season, would you pray that God would form in you the right vision and stir in you the right motives and strengthen you to carry out the right actions so that you can faithfully carry out God's work in God's way. Church, let's spend some time in prayer as we respond to God's word together. Let's pray at this time.